Playwrights and epic poets had been writing their works for 3,500 years before someone took the time to look at them all and say, hey, wait a minute. All of these have something in common. They all have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And that man was Aristotle in 300 BC in a work known as the Poetics. It's time to tell our stories. Hello and welcome to another video in the Every Day is a Story All Its Own series. I'm really happy that you've come back. On last week's video, I talked about the 3 threes of good storytelling, and we went over the first set of threes, what I call the basics, which are the who, which is the characters, the where, which is the place, and the what, which is the main problem. Now in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the second set of threes, what I call the framework. And this is the beginning, the middle, and the end, which seems so simple until you sit down and you really look at how each one of these 3 does certain things in the telling of a good story. And that's what I'm going to go over today. So we're going to use 3 templates while we're talking about the beginning, the middle, and the end. The first one is Joseph Campbell's hero journey. And we're going to talk about the beginning, which is the separation, the middle, which is the initiation, and the end, which is the return. We're also going to talk about David Mamet's 3 uses of the knife, which comes from an old blues Leadbelly song. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about Freytag's pyramid. And that's simply the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement, or the wrapping up of things. So again, I'm really glad you're here. Let's talk about the framework of the 3 threes of good storytelling. It's been said by a lot of people in a lot of different ways, sometimes you'll hear it in films or in plays about writing, that anyone can write a good first act. Well, I don't know if that's true, but of everything that you have to do as a writer, writing the beginning is probably the easiest. You have a clean slate, you haven't yet started writing your IOUs to your audience, those things that you have to fulfill. Sometimes that's called Chekhov's gun. A gun appears in the first act of one of Chekhov's plays, so it needs to appear in the third act of the play, and indeed it does. So there are a lot of things, though, that have to get accomplished in the beginning of your story. First is you're setting your tone. You're setting your atmosphere. You're letting people know what the genre is. Is it a Western? Is it a Gothic of some kind? Because those things are going to create certain expectations. They're going to create tropes. And tropes sometimes get a bad rap. They're confused with cliches. But a trope of a good horror story is what they come to expect. So that's the gloomy, haunted, secluded castle on the far side of the woods. So it becomes really, really important. And as long as you bring something new to your tropes, then they're not going to be cliches and everything's going to be fine. So what else do we do in the beginning? The beginning, we have sort of the 0 growth point for the main character, for the protagonist. Oftentimes they've been stuck in a rut. Even if they're comfortable and they're happy, they're not growing. So in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, we have what's called the call to adventure, which comes in the separation. So you have to leave what's familiar and you need to go off. In the last video, I talked about Frodo leaving the Shire and Dorothy leaving Kansas. And those are the really important things that you set up in the beginning. We also in the beginning have what is called the inciting incident. The inciting incident is that thing that shakes the person out. Something is being asked of them. Something new has to be coming into focus for them in order for them to solve problems and go on and do what they need to do. And they can either answer the call of adventure or they don't. And of course, in almost every story, even if they initially say no, ultimately they do answer the call of adventure. They leave, they have that separation, and they move on. Now, the playwright David Mamet, he used something called the 3 uses of the knife, which talks about the 3-act structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it became a book that I encourage everybody to read. But the 3 uses of the knife are based on an old blues song by Leadbelly. And in the first act, the first verse of the song, The lover is using the knife to spread butter on bread to feed their lover. So that's a pretty positive, very safe use of the knife in order to nurture and feed your partner. But that changes as they go on, which I'll talk about the beginning, the middle, and the end when I get to it. Then also sometimes on TV you'll have your cold open or you'll have your teaser. In screenwriting, as you know, they want you to set everything up in your first 10 pages, and by page 17 or so, you're going to have your inciting incident. You're going to have your call to adventure, and you're going to go on and you're going to do what you need to do. So in Freytag's terms, this would be the exposition. Exposition, you have to do it carefully. It's definitely not just laying out backstory. You have to remember to show and not just tell. And those are the things that kind of go into the beginning. So as you can see, it's a lot of stuff and it has to be done well. It's the way that you're going to hook your audience and make sure that they come on and stay with you so they get into the middle, which I'm going to talk about next. Now it's time to talk about the middle of the story. And this may take a little time because this is the hardest thing to do well. This is really where a writer shows their skills and where a professional writer really makes their money. So let's get started. There are a lot of expectations with the middle, but the hardest part about the middle is it's the biggest and it's easy to get lost. Sam Graber is a Minneapolis-based playwright that has collaborated quite a bit with Seven Stories Theater Company over the years. We've done some full-length world premieres for Sam, and we've also done some staged readings as well as some workshops of his works. Well, Sam also does a really good blog, and I'll put the link to that blog in the description for this episode. Well, in his latest blog where he talks about what is a play about, he uses a really good metaphor that I'd like to share with you for this. In the beginning, you're in a river, and it's a very nice river. Now, Sam lives in Minneapolis, which is in Minnesota, which is where the headwaters of the Mississippi River are. So the Mississippi River is fairly easy to navigate. You think of river boats, you think of pole raft, Huck and Jim in the classic Mark Twain story. But the Mississippi River eventually empties out into the Gulf of Mexico and then into the Atlantic Ocean. That's a whole different situation where you could easily wind up shipwrecked, just totally lost in your navigation if you don't plot things well in your story. So let's really break down the middle and really figure out what's going on here and what it's supposed to accomplish. Well, in the terms of the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, this is the place of initiation. Now, as everybody knows, an initiation is not supposed to be easy. There are a lot of obstacles. There are a lot of problems to solve. The protagonist is really pushed. The initiate is really trying to break boundaries, find new things inside of themselves. Sometimes they break down. If you think of an officer and a gentleman, thinking about quitting boot camp and leaving, not getting through it, or officers training school, actually. And so in all of these cases, there's the endurance, and we find ourselves really, really rooting for the character. In this initiation stage, this is where Rocky in the famous movies is undergoing his training and then has to get in the ring, almost flounders, almost fails. David Mamet really talks about the middle in the three uses of the knife in the best way that I've ever heard, really breaking down what Act 2 is all about. So also what you're trying to do is you're trying to build and maintain tension over a fairly long period of time. So in traditional screenwriting wisdom, we have the 3-act structure. And in that, we use 14 scenes, 28 scenes in the middle, and then 14 scenes in the end. 56 scenes to start. Now, the number will change as you grow, but I encourage all of you screenwriters out there to start with those 56 scenes and then to go from there. It's a really, really solid structure that works. Well, 28 scenes in the middle. You definitely need something in that midpoint. A new character, a new revelation, so the exposure of a secret, some new obstacle. The antagonist is usually winning really, really consistently there, and we're really starting to wonder if the protagonist is going to succeed. So again, a lot going on in the middle. So if your middle is not working, if it's breaking down for you, there are several things that could be going on. Perhaps your problem is too simple. The hero simply doesn't have big enough obstacles, strong enough antagonists, and problems to solve, and so it gets boring and you're filling time with action scenes or a lot of talking or a lot of waiting around. So that could be a problem. Also, maybe your scope is too strong, too small rather, not strong enough. And so by the scope, it means, the big worldview, the big themes. That's where themes kind of come into play now. If they're not big enough, if they're not thorny enough, if the stakes are not high enough, then your middle could get very muddy. It could go off subject. Maybe the protagonist is not being pushed hard enough because they're not complex enough. So the problems on the outside aren't creating crises, aren't creating challenges for the inside, for the character's psychology. Maybe your plot is too complicated, so you've gone too far with any of those one things. The character's too complicated, so they're not consistent. Or there are just too many obstacles, too many problems for the protagonist, and it really gets exhausting for the audience. So those are all the things that you have to watch, because through the middle, your character is going to grow. This is where their arc is really going to show up. They're going through this initiation. They're going through all these changes. Luke goes into the cave in The Empire Strikes Back, and he has to face himself. That's a really complicated problem. That leads to a lot of character growth and a lot of insight. Okay, so again, you want to build and you want to sustain tension because the stakes are getting higher. Let's go back to David Mamet's 3 uses of the knife. The second use of the knife is to shave with. Now, shaving is an okay thing, except when you're thinking about something like maybe Sweeney Todd and what he's doing with that razor blade, or a film from 1995 called Murder in the First, which starred Christian Slater, Gary Oldman, and Kevin Bacon. It's about a prisoner who tries to escape from Alcatraz, and the warden, played so well by Gary Oldman, really terrorizes him because he's made a fool of him by trying to escape. Well, there's a scene where Oldman is shaving, and the tension builds really, really well. And he starts talking softly as he's shaving, and then he cuts himself with the razor. He starts to bleed in the neck, and he punches the mirror, he shatters it, and his image distorts. That lets us know that the monster's coming out. The shadow side of this warden is coming out, and we better pay attention. Well, he begins to walk back and forth, and Kevin Bacon is trussed up, his arms are over, he's hanging down, and he's really, really vulnerable. And the director keeps showing the shot of this razor. And sure enough, as Oldman gets more and more agitated and accuses Bacon of threatening his job and his ability to take care of his family, he explodes and he takes the razor and he severs the prisoner's Achilles heel. So that's how that use, we're going from buttering bread to shaving, which could quickly become a dangerous thing. The neck is exposed, the jugular vein, all of those kinds of things. So that really is what you're trying to do in the middle. Now, let's talk about the end. Okay, so we've come to the end, the last part of what I call the framework. So if you've done all that you were supposed to do, if you've written your IOUs, then you're ready to pay them off. If you've created a lot of tension about the outcome, about the problem, the stakes have been raised, then you're in good shape to move on to your end. And the end wants to accomplish a lot of things. They're very dependent on the kind of story you're writing, and that's something that I'm going to talk about as we go along here on the end. So again, you want to pay your IOUs. If you had that gun in the first act, make sure it's used in the third act. If there was some kind of key place or a key memory or a key photograph, you want to make sure that that comes into play in the third act, because one way to surely disappoint and anger your audience is to not pay your IOUs. Now, this gets very thorny. A lot of things now, it's very trendy to leave things open-ended. You don't want to spoon feed an ending to your audience. They want to figure some stuff out on their own. Now, if you look at Christopher Nolan's movie Inception with the top, does it fall? Does it not fall? Maybe that's a little too open-ended, but you definitely want to leave possibilities. Also, too, if you're doing a long-form narrative, if you're doing any kind of serial work, if you're hoping for a sequel, if you're writing a screenplay, then of course you do want to leave things open-ended. But I would suggest you want to solve one problem. You want to bring the arc to the end. You want to have the main character return to talk about that last stage in the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. So they want to come back and they need to be changed. They need to have a new relationship. If they've come home, their relationship to that home is going to be different, to the people around them. In shamanic terms, in Native American studies terms, and in other cultures around the world, when the shaman goes out, when they go into the cave, when they go into the woods, when they go on their vision quest, and they undergo their changes and they get their insights, they have their vision, they need to come back to the community and share that knowledge. So that's what your hero oftentimes is doing. And we know they're going to be better off for it. And because of the empathy, because of the link between us and that character, we're going to be better off for it as well. So sometimes a new cycle is going to start. In terms of Freytag's pyramid, we're talking about the denouement. We're tying things up. And again, like I said, that's going to vary depending on your goals for, is this a hard end to a story, or is it going to move on to something else? Now, one last thing that we're going to talk about before we wrap up the end here is to talk about the third use of the knife. So in the Lead Belly song, first buttering the bread, then shaving with the knife. Well, the third part, the third use of the knife, is to kill your lover when you find out they're having an affair with someone else. Now, this immediately makes me think of Brian De Palma's The Untouchables, also a movie from the 1990s, and a really, really good high-tension scene with Robert De Niro. He's playing Al Capone, and he has the baseball bat. And he's holding this baseball bat, which, you know, that's used for the great American pastime. But he's holding it, and he's talking about enthusiasms. He's talking about baseball. And his monologue ends with him collapsing someone's skull with this baseball bat. And there's this great overhead shot where the head's on the table. There's an exquisite white tablecloth where the pool of blood is kind of spilling. But anyway, again, that's the turnaround of this thing that's used for entertainment. It's used for sport, and suddenly it becomes a deadly weapon. So we're coming now to the end of the arc. We're wrapping up. The antagonist has shown their full force. They've thrown everything that they can at the protagonist. The protagonist has been challenged, and now they achieve their goal. And that's all the stuff that happens through the end. So beginning sets up, the middle, the obstacles, the problems, the antagonist, the end. We have some kind of solution. And that's in a short story or in a long-form narrative, a TV show that goes on for years. We always have this where the cycle ends and the cycle starts again. That becomes so key. And for all you actors out there, and those of you who may write monologues or use monologues in any kind of way, even a monologue should have a short arc. The character should solve some problem, answer some kind of question, so that by the end, they're a little different and they're ready to go on with something else. So that's all I have for you today. I want to tell you about some upcoming episodes. It's the end of the year now. The holidays are coming up. The next two things I'm going to do are my first two top 10 lists. The first one's going to be my favorite holiday movies, which I'm going to put up probably on Christmas Eve, so you can have a look at that. And I'm going to tie in what we've talked about a little bit so far: character, place, main problem, and the beginning, middle, and end. Some of my favorite examples in those 10 movies. And then the next top 10 list is going to be my favorite books on structure, be screenwriting, be it playwriting, and some other books that I'm going to put in there as well, which I think will be very helpful for you. So again, thank you for tuning in. Go out into the world, tell your stories, and remember that every day truly is a story all its own. Bye now.